haven't even had Thanksgiving yet, and people are already getting ready for Christmas. I've got one Baptist minister friend, and his wife has already got all 6 of their Christmas trees up. The mantel's all decorated, and even the outside lights are on. And so if it starts to snow early, you've got her to blame. So, yes, it would. That would help a lot. We definitely need the spirit of Christmas, very much so. So, as we continue our look at the book of Daniel, as we come to chapter 6 of Daniel, we need to be careful how we handle the events we're about to look at. We need to be careful for a couple of reasons. One is because it's such a familiar passage of Scripture, and when we are as familiar with the passage as we are with this one, it's easy to assume that we really understand it. And that assumption leads us to kind of read into it something that isn't there, or maybe at times to leave out something that is. I don't know if you have had those times where you kind of go back and you reread something and it's like all of a sudden, oh, I missed that. You know, maybe it's just one word that changed everything, or you begin to realize that what you thought was there isn't actually there. So it's important that when we come to passages that are so familiar to us, such as Daniel chapter 6, that we read them and reread them several times to ensure we don't miss or leave out something. Also, it's very easy to get sidetracked away from the focus of the book of Daniel, and the focus of this chapter especially, and begin to see this chapter as a blueprint for how we are to live our lives by being like Daniel and following his example. And don't get me wrong, that's not entirely bad, but to focus on that aspect of things completely misses the point and the purpose of the book of Daniel. And like we've talked about earlier, begins to reduce it down to just pure moralism. Okay? So remember, we said at the beginning of the series, we've got to be careful not to do that to the first half of the book of Daniel, and that idea of reducing it to pure moralism. But sadly, that's what is usually done with the first half of the book of Daniel. People kind of zip through it, and we look at all the moral values there, and we kind of leave it at that. So as we look at the first 10 verses today of chapter 6, we're going to set up the discussion of the lion's den and see how the lion's den happened and the underlying issues. So we will not get to the lion's den itself today. But now, what we have seen in the first 3 chapters of Daniel is that Daniel and his companions are in Babylonian captivity, along with the others that are in exile and the great king Nebuchadnezzar. We have seen God revealing himself and showing the great king that he rules the world. But we also see that the king thinks that he's the one who rules the world. But God shows Nebuchadnezzar over and over through Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah that he is the one in control. And then finally, in chapter 4, God sends him into the wilderness with a mental illness to live like an animal for 7 years until he bows the knee and acknowledges that God is God and that he is the one who rules and he is worthy of the king's worship and praise. Then in chapter 5, Nebuchadnezzar's gone. Poof! No fanfare, no explanation. We just suddenly skip through history past 3 other kings to the time of Belshazzar and his co-regency with his father. No information about the rest of Nebuchadnezzar's life, how he lived from that point on after he had acknowledged God. We just witness his conversion, and then, boom, Belshazzar's co-regent and referred to as king. And the Persian army is walking into the city of Babylon without a fight while Belshazzar is partying and wining and dining his buddies and desecrating the gold goblets from the temple in Jerusalem. And he defies God Most High in the process. So, the Persians enter the city. Belshazzar is removed by Darius, which is probably the name the governor Ugabaru took when he took the city for Cyrus, king of the Medes and the Persians. And now we're in Daniel chapter 6, and Darius is ruling. We skip from the Babylon king Nebuchadnezzar down through history about 70 years to another Babylonian king, then to the Medes and Persians who are now in control, and Darius is king. And through all of this upheaval and change, through everything that is going on, the one name that remains is, if you would, Daniel. Through all of it, through everything that's going on, the one name that remains is Daniel, the servant of the Most High God. His consistent presence in the midst of the captivity reminds us, and also those who were there in captivity at the time, and all from that time until now, that if you would, God is faithful to His people and always keeps His promises. And in this instance specifically, His promise to preserve His people. Even though there will be times He must discipline His people, God will not forsake His people. Remember, the book of Daniel is not about Daniel and his companions and their morality. That's not what it's about. The book of Daniel, if you would, is about God and His sovereignty and His righteousness and His justice and faithfulness. The book of Daniel is about God, not men. But we have a tendency to make those first 6 chapters about the men rather than about God. So, when we see these first six chapters as being about Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, we reduce those chapters to children's Sunday school stories about morality and throw away the message about the great God that we serve and His sovereignty over kings and kingdoms. Yet sadly, that is what we tend to do with most scriptures, especially the passages we feel we are very familiar with and that we really understand. In Daniel chapter 5, his Babylonian name was used several times. But now that the Medes and the Persians have taken Babylon, he is again called Daniel. One of the things we've looked at through this study is the Babylonians tried to make Daniel a Babylonian. But they couldn't do it. They tried to change his diet. And it appears they eventually did to some extent, but he still wasn't a Babylonian. They changed where he lives, and that didn't make him a Babylonian. They changed his language. He still wasn't a Babylonian. They changed his name, and still he wasn't a Babylonian. They changed his job and vocation, and that didn't make him a Babylonian either. They even changed his training and his education, and still none of those things made him a Babylonian. And now that the Babylonians have been conquered and their control is gone, he is still Daniel. The new rulers don't refer to him by the name the Babylonians give him. They call him Daniel. Why? Because he's not a Babylonian. Everything that Babylon tried to do, they failed to change him. He is still Daniel. And that is a reflection of the faithfulness of God in the book of Daniel. For you see, if you would, Daniel's faithfulness is a mirror of the faithfulness of God's faithfulness to preserve His people. The kingdom of Judah fell to Babylon. The kingdom of Babylon fell to the Medes and the Persians. And through all of the turmoil and upheaval, if you would, God has preserved Daniel and His people. And also He preserved His people under the rule of Babylon, even though many were taken captive and sent into exile. This is also a reflection of faith that brings God honor and glory. When we look at the life of Daniel, what we see is a faithfulness that honors God, that brings Him glory and honor. So let's begin looking at our text for today as we pick up with the first 4 verses of chapter 6. It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. Hang on to that. Don't forget that, okay? Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. This is a marvelous picture of faithfulness. Understand something. Daniel's faithfulness doesn't honor God because he has become a martyr or a missionary. He's also not serving as a minister or an elder or a deacon. He's not in charge of some special ministry in the church. Yet we tend to visualize those things as being the things that typically are honorable to God. You know, you want to honor God, well, go into some kind of a ministry. Take charge of this ministry. Do this. Be a missionary if you really want to honor God. But that's not Daniel. Daniel's faithfulness doesn't fall into any of those categories, and it still pleases and honors God. Daniel isn't serving in the temple. He's not even in Jerusalem. But he's faithful, and God is pleased and honored. He's over 1,000 miles away in captivity, serving foreign kingdoms who oppose God, and his faithfulness honors and pleases God in those circumstances. Ian Duguid writes, if you would, the first point to observe in this chapter is that Daniel has learned how to live as a pilgrim. From the outset of his career in Babylon, Daniel was in his culture, but not of his culture. On one hand, he didn't withdraw from Babylonian culture as far as he could in order to avoid being stained by it. On the contrary, he had now served the empire faithfully for almost 70 years. Think about that for a minute as we continue, if you would. Far from using his age as an excuse to retire, he continued to serve the new administration. Belshazzar had been replaced as king by Darius, and the Babylonian Empire had been replaced by that of the Medes and the Persians. But Daniel kept on serving. In fact, Daniel served the empires so well that he continued to get promoted. He's not serving in some high-ranking religious position and a non-existent hierarchy of the church or anything like that. He is a captive who has been exiled, and he honors God who exiled him with his life and his service. And if you would, he is a blessing even to those whom he serves who do not know God. So as we consider our text and the previous text of Daniel and his faithfulness that honors God, we see that if you would, this type of faithfulness is a blessing to mankind. Not just to God's people, to everyone. I mean, if only that could be said of us, that the mark of Christ in our lives and our walk with him as the redeemed who have been purchased by his shed blood, that we would live our lives in such a way that even in the places we may work that have absolutely nothing to do with the ministry of the gospel, that people would look at our lives and see the faithfulness of God and our faithfulness to him and be blessed because there is nobody else they would rather promote for position than us. That is the life of Daniel. And that is also the faithfulness of our God. Keep in mind that Daniel is serving like this because he has been told to. He is following the instructions he's been given. Say, what? When was he told to do that? Well, it's in Jeremiah 29. Everyone loves Jeremiah 29:11. Okay? Everybody loves that. They love it because they like to tear it out, kicking and screaming out of its context and beat it until it says something that was never intended to say. Okay? But when we look at Jeremiah 29:1-7, we learn why Daniel is doing what he is doing, if we pick up there at the first verse. This is the text of the letter that the prophet Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem to the surviving elders among the exiles and to the priests, the prophets, and all the other people Nebuchadnezzar had carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Now remember that Daniel and his companions, they're included in that. So as we continue, this was after King Jehoiakim and the queen mother, the court officials and the leaders of Judah and Jerusalem, the skilled workers and the artisans had gone into exile from Jerusalem. He entrusted the letter to Elisah, son of Shaphan, and to Gemariah, son of Hilkiah, whom Zedekiah, king of Judah, sent to King Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. It said, "This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there. Do not decrease. Also, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper." Wow. God told Daniel and the rest of the captives to seek the welfare of the place that they have been sent into exile, and that's what Daniel did. Not only that, Daniel sought the welfare of the place where he was exiled in such an exemplary fashion that he is not killed when Darius comes to power. Think about that. Darius comes in, he doesn't know who's who. Typically, when a new king would come in after conquering a nation, what you do is you get rid of all the top advisors, all the important people, of which Daniel would have been included. But Daniel's spared. And what happens quickly? Darius wants to promote Daniel over all the satraps and administrators soon after he has made Daniel one of the satraps. One of the three administrators, I'm sorry. He wants to make him second in the kingdom. Because if you would, he obeyed God and looked to the best interests of the country where he was sent into exile. Daniel is serving the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians with the utmost integrity because God has raised them up. He understands that. They're in power because God has put them in power. He's not trying to Judaize the culture or Christianizing the culture as we would say today, although he does not compromise his faith when confronted. He wasn't trying to change the culture. We say today, if you're a real Christian, you'll go into government and go into politics and you'll take it over and you'll make them so that you can make everybody live under our rule instead of under someone else's rule. That's not what Daniel is doing, nor did his companions. He wasn't feeding the poor. That isn't the faithfulness that stood out here in Daniel chapter 6. Is any of this a bad thing? No. But that's not what Daniel's doing. He wasn't transforming the system, nor improving the plight of those who were in exile with him. Nowhere do we see that Daniel is attempting to see that the Jewish exiles get better treatment. You see, if you would, Daniel was helping Darius diminish his losses. Remember verse 2? Remember I told you to hang on to that verse 2. Daniel 6:2, if you would. With 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. That's what Daniel was doing. He was making sure the king did not suffer loss. That's his job. Make sure that the king who rules over you and oppresses you doesn't lose anything. Seems rather backward, doesn't it, the way we think today? But this is how Daniel's faithfulness is honoring God. That's what God told his people to do. Live there, work there, serve there, because if they prosper, you're going to prosper. Don't get lost in the perspective that so many Christians have fallen into, that we have to be of the world but not in it. That's not what we're called to be. That's backwards. We're called to be, if you would, in the world but not of it. And that's where so many Christians have been led astray. And that doesn't mean that we will be in the world after that doesn't mean that we will be in the world after we change it to be like us. In other words, we want to change the world so that we can no longer feel uncomfortable here. We don't want to feel uncomfortable in this world, so let's change it and make it like us. Sorry, but Christ reserves making that change for himself with a new heaven and a new earth. And until he returns, we need to understand something. Just like Daniel, if you would, we are exiles and pilgrims, foreigners in this world filled with sin. And until Christ returns, we are called to be faithful and be a blessing wherever God puts us. If you're working at Walmart, or in the mines, or you're a teacher, or whatever place you may happen to be working, whatever it may be, if you would, you do not have to make the place of your employment Christian in order to be faithful to God. There's so many in the workplace that and their job may be as simple as making sure their employer doesn't suffer loss while on their watch. But they think they need to look for something of a higher spiritual calling in order to honor and please God. And so they believe they need to leave what they're doing and become a missionary or a preacher, or do something along those lines, and to fill some other high-ranking position, like I said, non-existent hierarchy of the church, in order to really please God and serve Him. And to them, God would say, if you would, no. Be faithful to me, be faithful and honor me where I have placed you, and be a blessing. He puts us where we are for a reason. It's one of the things that we've looked at throughout the first 6 chapters of Daniel, is the fact that the exiles were placed in Babylon not because they needed Babylon, but because Babylon needed them. He put them there for a purpose, for a reason. Yeah, part of it was discipline. The other part of it was he was going to work through them where they are, in the situation that they found themselves in. So what we are seeing is not Daniel just trying to live a moral life to make God happy. Rather, we see Daniel as living a life of faithfulness that honors and magnifies God in the eyes of those around him. Not because he's trying to earn God's approval, but if you would, because of the relationship he has with God, who is faithful, and his desire to bring God glory through the life he lives. Let's look at the next verse in our text. Verse 5, if you would. Finally, these men said, "We will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God." God-honoring faith is the result of true religion. Remember, in verse 4, they're trying to find some way to keep Darius from promoting Daniel, who is in exile, even though he's now been there for around 70 years. They don't want him promoted to the highest place of honor in the kingdom. I mean, we still see the hate for the Jews going on there. I mean, after all, they're different. They're not like everyone else. And they're still considered to be inferior. After all, they don't serve all these other gods. They think there's just this one God. They're different from the rest of us. And so they're frantic to make sure that Daniel does not get this high position. After all, he may impose this one God religion on us and their dietary requirements, and he may force us to act like he does. Not only that, bribery and embezzlement were common among those put in these types of position. And obviously, if you're that type of a person, you don't want to be held accountable by a man who's not only a Jew and an exile, but also who cannot be bought and is determined to see that the king does not suffer loss under his watch. And since he isn't like us, and since he can't be bought, well, let's see if we can find out if he's doing something wrong. So if you would, they begin to scrutinize everything he does and find that his service to the king is impeccable, that he is serving with the highest of integrity. So what do they decide they have to do? Well, they're going to have to create a situation where the law of God Almighty is at odds with the law of the Medes and the Persians. That's the only way to bring Daniel down, is to force him to choose between his faithfulness to God and his loyalty to the king. Because you see, if you would, they know that Daniel will not compromise his faithfulness to God for any reason, even in the face of death. That is the example that Daniel has set. That's what they understand. They know that Daniel is not going to compromise. And so if they can get the law of his God at odds with the law of the Medes and the Persians, we'll get him. I'm reminded of Psalm 119. Very long psalm. But verses 9 through 24, read if you would. How can a young person stay on the path of purity? By living according to your word. I seek you with all my heart. Do not let me stray from your commands. I have hidden your word in my heart that I might not sin against you. Praise be to you, Lord. Teach me your decrees. With my lips I recount all the laws that come from your mouth. I rejoice in following your statutes as one rejoices in great riches. I meditate on your precepts and consider your ways. I delight in your decrees. I will not neglect your word. Be good to your servant while I live, that I may obey your word. Open my eyes, that I may see wonderful things in your law. I am a stranger on earth. Do not hide your commands from me. My soul is consumed with longing for your laws at all times. You rebuke the arrogant who are accursed, those who stray from your commands. Remove me from their scorn and contempt, for I keep your statutes. Though rulers sit together and slander me, your servant will meditate on your decrees. Your statutes are my delight. They are my counselors. Think about that. You know, if you would, it's almost as if the psalmist is painting a prophetic picture of the life of Daniel. Or maybe perhaps Daniel keeps recounting these passages to himself as he remains faithful. Let's pick back up with our text. Verse 6. So these administrators and satraps went as a group to the king and said, "May King Darius live forever. The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now, your majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered, in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed." So King Darius put the decree in writing. Now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Notice, the earlier passages, we're looking at the satraps and the administrators trying to keep Daniel out of this position. Now they walk in and they're telling Darius, well, everybody wants this. Not just us. All your advisors and your governors. We've all gotten together. And so these guys go to the king and pretend to be the king's greatest fans ever, and get him to issue a decree that cannot be changed or repealed under the Persian law. King doesn't know why, but he's flattered. And so he does it. And the decree is one that these guys know will bring Daniel into conflict with the king. Because if you would, this law brings the law of the Persians into conflict with the law of God, whom Daniel serves. And they know Daniel is not going to violate the law of his God. Daniel is going to be faithful to God no matter what. You see, what these guys don't realize is that Daniel's faithfulness to God does not only benefit the king, it benefits them also. Because if you would, when the king prospers, those in his service who prove to be loyal prosper also. But they're not getting this. They're not understanding that Daniel's faithfulness is a positive impact for them as well. All they can see is, we can't get away with the things we want to get away with. And he's just an exiled Jew. He's inferior. Even though over the past 70 years, he and his companions have proved over and over again that they are superior. But they can't see the big picture because of their jealousy and corruption. Daniel is in exile, and they don't like the exiles, especially Daniel, because he's going to be put in charge. Not only that, Daniel is a man of the highest integrity because of his faithfulness to God, and so he cannot be bought. And what does Daniel do when he hears about the decree? He does what he's always done. If you would, he prays to God 3 times a day facing Jerusalem. Nothing has changed for Daniel. He is still faithful to God and honoring him. He didn't think to himself, I could just stop praying until the 30 days are over and then I'll resume my prayers. He could have, or could he? No, he couldn't. Because if you would, Daniel knows that once you stop something for a period of time, it's hard to start it again. He knew that he had to remain consistent and faithful even in his prayer life if he was going to live his life honoring God. And that speaks volumes to us today. Because we're seeing the results of what could have happened then if Daniel had decided, well, I'll just get quiet for 30 days and we'll let this thing pass, and then we'll get back to praying again. Churches closed their doors for months. And now, even though they've been open for months, if you would, believers can't seem to get themselves back into consistent faithfulness and gathering with the body of Christ. Satan managed to interrupt the pattern of faithfulness, and now it is so hard to become committed to gathering again faithfully for so many who call themselves God's people. Daniel stands as a testimony of faithfulness that honors God, in that his response to the decree is, no matter what the kingdom of this world decrees or says to do, if you would, Daniel will not stop being faithful. Period. And sadly, that's not what happened to most of God's people over the last 19 months. How do I know? I've witnessed the same thing that every one of my minister friends has witnessed. For example, we put messages and church services online, and while the video shows, yes, in some cases, many views, oh, great, everybody's out there, they've seen the video. But the channel page has an analytics section you go to. And the average length of time it was viewed, 2 to 6 minutes. Oh, click. Yeah, I saw it. Do you understand what that says? People popped in just long enough to register that the video was viewed, but they didn't actually watch it. Head off someplace else. And I get the feeling through all of this that Satan has been sitting back saying, gotcha. And people don't even realize it. And now they can't seem to get themselves back to gathering with the body because Satan got them so sidetracked long enough that their faithfulness now lies somewhere else. The Lord's Day became a day of recreation and relaxation, of going here and there. Refusing to give up faithfulness and have home Bible study in order to try to remain connected to God. The decree said to Daniel, if you don't give up your faithfulness to your God, then you will die. And Daniel, by his actions, said, if you would, then I will die. But if I do, I will die faithful to the God who has been faithful to me. I will die honoring him. And that, my friends, is one of the reasons the book of Daniel is so important for us today. The lesson is a critical lesson that God's people need to learn today. We are exiles in this world, but so many are living like this world is our home. What we need to do, if you would, we need to bow the knee and ask God's forgiveness for letting Satan get us sidetracked during these turbulent times and get back to living lives of faithfulness that honors God. We need to be faithful in the workplace. We need to be faithful in our times of recreation. We need to be faithful once again in the gathering of the body. Because are we trying to earn God's favor? No. If you would, because God has shown us favor and been faithful to us and had continued to keep his promise to us and always will keep his promises. We're faithful to him because he is worthy of our praise and worship and faithfulness. What it comes down to is, if you would, we are faithful to him because he is God. And that's reason enough. He has been faithful to us. He continues to bring us through turbulent times in our nation, in our homes, in our families, all constantly faithful to us. We need to be faithful to him. And as we're looking at the first part of Daniel chapter 6, that is what is jumping out of this passage. Is faithfulness that honors God, no matter the circumstances, no matter where you are at. We remain faithful. Don't have to be a preacher. Don't have to be a missionary or a martyr or anything like that to honor God. We can honor God where we are by being faithful in all things. And understand that if we are being faithful and honoring God the way He expects us to do it, and God's people aren't the only ones that benefit. Everyone around us benefits by our faithfulness. It really comes down to giving our all to Him. Our thoughts, our motives, our praise, everything about us, it's all given for Him. Are you giving your all for Him? You maybe need to refocus a little bit. As your faithfulness maybe become a little bit tarnished along the way. Maybe we need to reinvigorate it a little bit. No, Daniel wasn't faithful to God because he was trying to earn some special favor. He was faithful to God because God had been faithful to him, and He is God.